Life in medieval Europe was not easy. For most people, the rhythms of existence were dictated by the church, the land, and the unpredictable whims of nature. Hunger, disease, and war were common companions. Yet in the middle of this difficult world, another struggle unfolded, one that lived inside the body itself. The battle between desire and the demand for spiritual purity. From the earliest days of the Middle Ages, the Church proclaimed itself guardian of the soul and master of the body. It sought to regulate not only prayer, work, and morality, but also sexuality, the deepest human instinct. Desire was painted as dangerous, a gateway to sin, and a threat to salvation. In the sermons of priests and the writings of theologians, lust appeared as a fire capable of consuming reason and dragging souls to eternal damnation. Marriage was the only acceptable outlet, and even then, sex was not celebrated. It was tolerated. The purpose of union, according to official doctrine, was simple: the creation of children. Pleasure for its own sake was frowned upon, and anything that strayed beyond procreative intercourse was condemned. Adultery, fornication, same-sex relations, even excessive passion within marriage, each could send a Christian tumbling toward hell. Yet these strict teachings stood in constant tension with human reality. Behind monastery walls, where monks vowed to live in celibacy, secret relationships blossomed. In convents, nuns sometimes exchanged affection and intimacy beyond the rules of their order. And among ordinary people, desire found countless ways to slip through the cracks of doctrine. Confession, a window into desire. One of the most revealing practices of medieval Christianity was confession. On the surface, confession offered believers a way to unburden their souls, to find forgiveness and peace. But in practice, it also became a system of surveillance. Priests were instructed to probe deeply, asking believers for detailed descriptions of their sins. This often included explicit questions about sexual behavior, questions that forced ordinary men and women to reveal their most intimate thoughts. A married woman might confess that her husband demanded pleasure beyond what the priest considered natural. A farmer's daughter might admit to premarital encounters in the fields. A monk might whisper about temptations in his cell at night. These stories, locked inside the confessional, revealed the gap between official ideals and the unstoppable persistence of human desire. The Church, in its effort to control sexuality, had unwittingly created a paradox. Confession allowed people to speak about sex more openly than perhaps in any other space of medieval society. In trying to suppress desire, the Church kept it alive in conversation, turning private sin into public narrative. The body under suspicion. Alongside religious control, medieval medical ideas added another layer of anxiety. Medicine was still rooted in ancient theories, heavily influenced by Galen and Aristotle. Doctors believed in the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to arise from imbalance, and sexuality was no exception. For women, the theories were especially harsh. Many physicians believed in the idea of the wandering womb, a superstition that claimed a woman's uterus could move around her body, causing illness, hysteria, or madness. The cure, they insisted, often involved sex or pregnancy, effectively binding women's health to male involvement. When couples failed to conceive, the blame usually fell on the woman. Invasive and humiliating examinations were performed, guided by ignorance rather than science. A woman's body was treated as a problem to be solved, a vessel judged for its fertility rather than its humanity. This medical worldview reinforced gender hierarchies. Men were seen as rational, controlled, and spiritually strong, while women were portrayed as weaker, more carnal, and prone to temptation. It was a belief that echoed through sermons, laws, and everyday life, giving shape to a society where women's sexuality was treated with suspicion and fear. The contradictions of celibacy. If ordinary men and women struggled under the Church's rules, the clergy themselves often fared no better. Priests, monks, and nuns were expected to remain celibate, devoting themselves entirely to God. But records from across Europe reveal that vows of purity were frequently broken. Some priests kept concubines or quietly fathered children. Monks slipped into town to visit brothels, or formed long-term relationships with women who lived near the monastery gates. Nuns, confined within convent walls, sometimes found affection with one another, or secretly exchanged letters and gifts with men outside. The gap between ideal and reality became a source of scandal. Church councils repeatedly issued warnings, reforms, and punishments against unholy unions. Yet the cycle continued. The truth was simple. Desire did not vanish with a vow. This hypocrisy did not go unnoticed by ordinary people. Tales and jokes circulated about lustful monks or wayward nuns, often appearing in the margins of manuscripts or whispered in taverns. The very institution that demanded purity often failed to uphold it. Fear of lust, fear of hell. Why was sexuality treated with such severity? For medieval Christians, lust was not just a bodily impulse, it was a spiritual threat. To give in to desire was to risk eternal damnation. The soul's salvation hung in the balance, and every act of pleasure carried the weight of judgment. Preachers warned that uncontrolled lust clouded reason, turned men into beasts, and opened the door to the devil. Illustrations in manuscripts depicted demons whispering into the ears of lovers, or dragging sinners to the fires of hell. Even dreams could be suspect, as night emissions or sexual fantasies were sometimes interpreted as demonic attacks. In this way, sexuality became a battlefield where heaven and hell fought for the soul. A kiss, a glance, or a touch was not just a personal choice. It was a moment that could tilt the scales of eternity. Daily reality. Desire persists. And yet, despite this atmosphere of fear, desire persisted. Lovers met in hidden corners of villages, exchanging tokens or sneaking away from watchful eyes. Folk traditions offered remedies for passion, herbs to stir desire, charms to bind lovers, and whispered prayers to saints for fertility. Even within the confines of marriage, couples carved out spaces of intimacy, finding moments of joy despite the heavy shadow of doctrine. Women, though restricted, developed quiet strategies of resistance, sharing knowledge with one another, using herbal remedies, or mocking the absurdities of male authority through humor and song. The human heart refused to be silenced. Beneath the surface of repression, medieval Europe pulsed with longing, rebellion, and the stubborn will to love. Closing of Part 1. The first layer of medieval sexuality, then, is one of control and contradiction. The Church sought to bind desire within chains of doctrine, confession, and fear. Medicine reinforced gender hierarchies, turning the female body into a site of suspicion. Yet reality resisted. Priests broke vows, couples sought pleasure, and ordinary people carried on with their desires in secret. This was only the beginning. For beyond the church and the doctor's eye lay other worlds. The poetic games of courtly love, the raw struggles of peasant marriages, and the myths of noble privilege. These stories, full of romance, exploitation, and imagination, form the next chapter in the complex history of medieval sexuality. If the church claimed mastery over the soul and the body, medieval society itself added further layers of control. Marriage, family, and inheritance were not merely private matters, they were the building blocks of the feudal order. Love, as modern people imagine it, was rarely the centerpiece. Instead, sex and marriage were tangled up with power, politics, and survival. Yet within this tightly controlled structure, new cultural movements blossomed. Poems, songs, and stories of courtly love transformed the way desire was expressed, while myths and rumors revealed both fear and fascination with sexuality. The Middle Ages was not a simple era of repression. It was a stage where contradictions played out, where noblemen and peasants alike sought ways to negotiate between passion and power. Courtly love. Desire without consummation. In the noble courts of the 12th and 13th centuries, a new form of cultural expression emerged. Courtly love. At first glance, it seems almost romantic, even modern, a celebration of passion, beauty, and longing. But courtly love was not about fulfilling desire. It was about controlling it, channeling it into poetry, music, and performance. At its heart, courtly love centered on a paradox. The lover was usually a knight or nobleman, and the beloved was a married lady of high status. The knight would devote himself to her with absolute loyalty, declaring her the source of his inspiration and his suffering. Yet he could not consummate the relationship. To do so would ruin the game. Instead, the passion unfolded in longing looks, whispered songs, coded gestures, and endless waiting. The pain of separation, the torment of unfulfilled desire, was itself the proof of love's nobility. For women, this tradition could provide rare forms of agency. Within the structure of courtly love, the lady often held the power. She could grant her knight a token of favor or deny him entirely. She became the judge of his devotion, his reason for living, and the unattainable star he could never touch. In a society where women's bodies were heavily controlled, this emotional dominance mattered. Courtly love allowed noble women to wield influence in a world that otherwise restricted their choices. But at the same time, it kept desire trapped in a world of performance, denying physical reality in favor of endless yearning. Peasant marriages, the harsh realities. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of medieval society, marriage looked very different. There were no poetic games, no elaborate songs of longing. Instead, unions were arranged based on survival, property, and labor. Marriage bound families together, secured land rights, and ensured children who could work the fields. Romance rarely entered into the equation. A young woman might be married off to a man chosen by her parents, sometimes against her will. A man might accept a wife because her family brought a small dowry or because she was strong enough to help with the harvest. Love, if it appeared, often came after marriage, or not at all. Domestic life was shaped less by passion than by necessity. Still, human desire found its way even into these unions. Couples shared beds in one-room cottages, sought moments of intimacy away from children, and whispered to one another in the shadows of barns and fields. But the power of lords and landlords loomed over peasant bodies. A family's fate could be altered by a lord's decision, and rumors swirled about the abuses of noblemen who exploited their power over peasants. The myth of the lord's right. Among the most enduring tales of medieval sexuality is the so-called lord's right, the idea that a feudal lord had the privilege to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night before her husband. Known in later times as jus primae noctis, the right of the first night, this story has fascinated generations. But historians agree, it was most likely a myth. No medieval law codes record such a right, and no reliable evidence suggests it was widely practiced. Instead, the tale probably functioned as a metaphor for feudal dominance. Whether or not the right existed in practice, it captured a deeper truth, that peasants' bodies were vulnerable to exploitation. In reality, noblemen did sometimes take sexual liberties with women under their authority. Servant girls, tenant daughters, and widows were especially at risk. Power created opportunity, and opportunity invited abuse. The myth of the lord's right may have exaggerated this reality, but it reflected a society where the bodies of the poor were often treated as property. Chastity belts. Symbol or reality? Just as the lord's right speaks more to myth than fact, another symbol of medieval sexuality has long captured the imagination: the chastity belt. Popular images show iron contraptions, locked around women's waists to prevent infidelity. But the truth is murkier. Evidence for widespread use of chastity belts is weak. Many surviving examples appear to be later inventions, created as curiosities during the Renaissance or even in the 19th century. Medieval references to chastity belts are often symbolic or satirical, mocking male anxiety about female sexuality. In reality, it is unlikely that medieval men locked their wives into metal cages. Instead, the chastity belt has become a mythic expression of the era's obsession with controlling desire. It represents not what people did, but what they feared: that women, left unchecked, might seek pleasure outside marriage. Fertility rituals and love potions. Despite the dominance of the church, folk traditions surrounding sex and fertility thrived. In villages across Europe, people turned to herbs, charms, and rituals when faced with problems of desire or childbearing. A woman struggling to conceive might drink a potion brewed from roots and spices, whispered over with secret words. Lovers might tie knots in a ribbon or hide tokens under a pillow to bind themselves to one another. Some rituals blended Christian prayer with older pagan practices, invoking saints and spirits alike. The line between medicine, magic, and superstition was thin. A priest might denounce love potions as witchcraft, yet villagers continued to use them in private. For people with little access to doctors or knowledge, these traditions offered a fragile hope against the uncertainties of life. The double edge of love. Courtly poetry, peasant hardships, noble myths, and folk remedies all reveal the contradictions of medieval sexuality. On one hand, desire was constantly controlled, by law, by custom, by fear. On the other, it overflowed these boundaries, finding new shapes in longing songs, whispered charms, and tales of power abused. Love was not only joy, it was also danger. It could elevate a knight into poetic glory or expose a peasant girl to exploitation. It could be a symbol of virtue or a cause for scandal. In every form, it was tied to power. The power of lords over peasants, the power of women within the games of courtly love, the power of myths to capture society's anxieties. Closing of Part 2. By the close of the medieval era, love and sexuality had become layered with contradictions. Noble courts celebrated passion while denying consummation. Peasant families endured arranged unions under feudal pressures. Myths like the Lord's Right and the chastity belt revealed society's fears, even if they were not historical truths. And all the while, human beings clung to rituals, herbs, and whispered charms to make sense of their desires. The story of medieval sexuality was far from finished. Beyond the courts and the villages lay hidden worlds, brothels, monasteries, bathhouses, where desire took on new forms, sometimes forbidden, sometimes celebrated. These secret spaces, where boundaries blurred, will form the next part of our journey. If the official story of medieval sexuality was one of control, laws, sermons, and myths, the unofficial story unfolded in shadows, on the margins of society, and in the secret corners of daily life. Behind monastery walls, inside bustling cities, and even in the pages of manuscripts, human desire revealed itself in ways that defied doctrine. Medieval people did not live as silent prisoners of repression. They joked, they loved, they rebelled, and they sought intimacy in spaces both hidden and public. To understand their world fully, we must step into these secret domains. Behind monastery walls. Monasteries and convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of purity. Monks and nuns vowed celibacy, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and service. But human nature often broke through the walls of devotion. Records tell of monks sneaking out to visit taverns or brothels, sometimes caught in scandalous situations. In some cases, entire communities of monks were accused of lax discipline, with their cloisters becoming places of feasting and sexual indulgence. Nuns, too, lived lives far more complex than the stereotype of silent devotion. Within the tight bonds of convent life, emotional and sometimes physical intimacy flourished. Some nuns exchanged letters filled with longing. Others formed deep friendships that may have crossed into physical relationships. In rare cases, pregnancies within convents exposed affairs with visiting priests or monks. The church often cracked down on these scandals, issuing reforms and punishments. Yet the persistence of such stories shows how desire could not be erased, even in the holiest spaces. Monasteries meant to suppress sexuality sometimes became hidden theaters of it. Queer desire and gender fluidity. Medieval Europe officially condemned same-sex relations, often punishing them harshly. Yet queer desire was very much present, surfacing in ways both subtle and bold. In cities, records of trials reveal men accused of sodomy, a crime that carried severe penalties. Some faced execution, others exile. Yet the repeated appearance of such trials across centuries suggests that same-sex relationships were more common than authorities wished to admit. Women, too, found ways to express intimacy with one another. Some nuns' letters read with unmistakable tenderness, describing longing that went beyond simple friendship. In rare but striking accounts, women disguised themselves as men to live with female lovers, sometimes maintaining the ruse for years. Cross-dressing blurred the lines of gender, often condemned as sinful but also tolerated in festive settings like carnivals. These moments of play revealed a fluidity that official doctrine denied but everyday life could not fully suppress. The world of brothels. While the church condemned lust as a deadly sin, medieval cities took a more pragmatic approach. Sex work, though morally frowned upon, was often tolerated and even regulated. In many towns, brothels operated under official licenses. City authorities argued that prostitution served a social purpose, providing an outlet for male desire that might otherwise spill into adultery or assault. It was the lesser evil in a society desperate to balance morality with reality. Brothels were usually placed in specific districts, often near city gates or rivers. Women working there came from many backgrounds. Some were widows with no means of support, others were daughters of poor families, and some were trafficked against their will. Life in the brothel could be harsh, but it was not always one-dimensional. Some women found a degree of independence, earning money and forging networks of solidarity. Others faced exploitation and violence, trapped by debt or social stigma. The paradox of sex work in medieval Europe lay in its dual status: condemned from the pulpit, yet protected by law. It was a shadowed profession that revealed society's deepest contradictions. Bathhouses and public spaces. Another unexpected side of medieval sexuality was the bathhouse. In towns and cities, communal baths provided spaces for hygiene, relaxation, and socializing. But they also became notorious as places of sexual encounter. Men and women bathed together in some establishments, sharing warm pools under candlelight. Travelers' accounts describe these scenes with both fascination and moral alarm. Bathhouses became associated with illicit liaisons, and moralists railed against their dangers. Yet they remained popular, a reminder that medieval people cared about cleanliness and pleasure far more than stereotypes suggest. For some, the bathhouse was a place of leisure; for others, it was a discreet venue for romance or sex. Public festivals and carnivals also opened spaces for playful expressions of desire. During these times, rules loosened, and cross-dressing, body songs, and suggestive games flourished. For a few days, the strict boundaries of everyday life were overturned, and sexuality spilled into the open. Erotic marginalia and humor. Perhaps the most surprising evidence of medieval sexuality hides in the margins of manuscripts. While monks copied holy texts with painstaking care, they sometimes filled the edges with doodles, jokes, and bizarre images. In these erotic marginalia, rabbits chase humans, monks flirt with nuns, and fantastical creatures engage in obscene acts. Cathedral carvings, too, sometimes included explicit imagery, hidden in corners where only the curious might find them. Far from being a world without humor, medieval Europe was full of laughter and bawdy jokes. Peasants sang songs about lust and adultery. Street performers mocked priests for their hypocrisy. Even in the sacred spaces of cathedrals and books, sexuality appeared as a source of humor, rebellion, and creativity. The everyday struggle. What unites these hidden stories is the persistence of desire. Whether in monasteries, brothels, bathhouses, or the margins of manuscripts, sexuality refused to remain under lock and key. People lived with contradictions. They confessed sins on Sunday and sought out brothels on Monday. They sang songs about lust while fearing hellfire. They carved erotic jokes into holy books even as they prayed for salvation. This was the everyday reality of medieval Europe. A world where sexuality was constantly policed yet constantly alive, shaped by both repression and resilience. Closing of Part 3. The hidden lives of monks and nuns, the presence of queer desire, the paradox of regulated brothels, the laughter and erotic marginalia. All of these reveal a medieval sexuality far richer and more complex than stereotypes allow. This was not an age of silence but of contradiction. Bodies condemned yet celebrated, desires forbidden yet pursued, love both mocked and honored. But another layer remained, darker and more fearful. In the medieval imagination, sex was not only a moral danger, it was a spiritual battlefield haunted by demons, witches, and supernatural terrors. That fearful world of lust and damnation forms the final chapter of our story. If medieval sexuality often unfolded in secrecy, laughter, or quiet rebellion, it also lived in a world of fear. To medieval Christians, sex was not only a sin to be confessed, it was a spiritual battleground. Desire could open the door to demons. Dreams could become assaults by spirits. Women could be accused of witchcraft for knowledge of herbs and fertility. Even kings and queens, whose bodies shaped dynasties, faced anxieties about sex and reproduction. The medieval imagination turned sexuality into a place where heaven and hell collided, where private longing was tangled with public terror. Demons of the night. Few fears struck medieval people more deeply than the idea of demonic lovers. Folklore and church teaching alike described spirits that preyed on humans in the dark. The incubus, a male demon, was said to visit women in their sleep, forcing them into unwanted unions. Its counterpart, the succubus, appeared as a female demon seducing men, draining their strength through sex. The symptoms of these encounters, nightmares, exhaustion, or nocturnal emissions, were interpreted as proof of demonic assault. Priests warned that succubi could steal men's seed, using it to create monstrous offspring. Healers prescribed prayers, charms, or protective symbols to guard against such nocturnal attacks. In reality, these fears reflected both limited medical understanding and deep anxieties about the uncontrollable nature of desire. The boundary between dream, fantasy, and sin blurred. A restless night could be read as a battle with Satan himself. Witchcraft and sexual terror. As the Middle Ages moved toward its later centuries, fears about witchcraft grew. Women who practiced folk medicine, midwifery, or fertility rituals were increasingly accused of serving the devil. Sexuality was central to these accusations. Witches were said to fly to Sabbaths where they fornicated with demons. They were accused of casting spells that withered men's virility or stirred uncontrollable lust. Some were even charged with stealing male genitals through sorcery, keeping them as charms or food for demons. Behind these wild claims lay deeper fears about women's knowledge and independence. Midwives who understood fertility, women who sold love potions, or widows who lived alone could all be painted as threats. The link between sex and witchcraft allowed authorities to target those who stepped outside social norms. Punishments were brutal: public shaming, flogging, exile, or execution. Sexuality became not just a private matter but cause for deadly persecution. Public penance and punishment. For ordinary sinners, punishment for sexual transgressions was less fatal but deeply humiliating. Medieval justice often relied on public penance, rituals of shame that turned sexuality into theater. A woman caught in adultery might be paraded through town in her undergarments, forced to confess before her neighbors. A man convicted of fornication could be made to stand barefoot in front of a church, holding a candle of penance. These punishments reinforced community values. They reminded everyone that sexuality was not merely private but tied to honor, reputation, and divine order. To sin sexually was to disrupt society, and society demanded a spectacle of discipline. Yet even these rituals revealed contradictions. For while punishment aimed to suppress desire, it also put sexuality on display, turning private acts into public stories. The line between shame and fascination was thin. The politics of royal desire. At the highest levels of society, sexuality carried enormous weight. Kings and queens did not simply marry for love. They married for dynasties, alliances, and power. A king's ability to father heirs was a matter of national survival. If he failed, rumors of impotence spread quickly, undermining his authority. Queens were scrutinized for fertility, their bodies treated as political vessels. Medical interventions, prayers, and rituals surrounded royal bedrooms, where sex was as much a duty as a desire. Affairs at court could topple reputations, spark wars, or shift alliances. The rumored lovers of queens, the mistresses of kings, the illegitimate children raised in shadows, all played roles in the complex game of medieval politics. Sex, in the royal sphere, was never just personal. It was power embodied. Hope, humor, and resilience. For all the fear, punishment, and control, medieval sexuality was not only a tale of darkness. It was also a story of resilience. People laughed at erotic jokes carved in cathedral corners. Lovers exchanged secret notes despite the threat of hell. Women shared herbs and knowledge to ease childbirth or spark desire. Men and women alike found ways to express intimacy, even under the eye of priests and lords. Erotic marginalia mocked authority. Folk songs celebrated lust. Courtly poems transformed longing into art. Brothels, bathhouses, and festivals carved out spaces where desire could be lived, however imperfectly. Sexuality, in all its complexity, survived repression. It found outlets in humor, ritual, rebellion, and quiet acts of love. Closing reflections. The story of medieval sexuality is not one of silence but of contradiction. The church thundered against lust, yet priests broke vows. Medicine pathologized women's bodies, yet women shared secret knowledge. Nobles played games of courtly love while peasants endured arranged marriages. Brothels were both condemned and licensed. Demons haunted beds, but laughter filled manuscripts. This was a world where sexuality was everywhere, feared, controlled, celebrated, punished, and endlessly negotiated. Far from being an age of simple repression, the Middle Ages was a tapestry of desire. At once joyful and anxious, violent and tender, fearful and resilient. In the end, what emerges is not a portrait of silence, but a deeply human story. where love and lust, faith and fear, power and passion intertwined in the long shadows of medieval Europe.